On a Tuesday morning in Baltimore, Caroline Fitch's husband uninvited her from his family reunion by text. 7 words. No punctuation. Sent at 7:14 a.m., while Caroline sat alone in a hospital waiting room, wearing the same shapeless coat Lorraine had once described, in front of company as such a practical choice for someone in her situation. Caroline's hands were cold. The waiting room smelled of disinfectant and recycled air. Her doctor had just finished explaining, in careful clinical language, that her body was showing signs of prolonged stress. Poor nutrition, disrupted sleep, markers that told a story her husband had stopped bothering to read. She was 44 years old, and she had not eaten a full meal in 11 days. She read the text once. Then she opened the next tab on her phone. What Daniel Fitch did not know, what Lorraine did not know, what Sasha, who had spent the previous weekend being introduced to the Fitch family as Daniel's colleague, certainly did not know, was that the woman sitting alone in that waiting room was the principal owner of Whitmore Property Holdings, 34 commercial properties across 4 states, valued at $18.7 million. One of those properties was the building where Daniel had worked for the last 6 years. He had been parking in her garage every single morning without knowing her name was on the deed. He sent 12 words to dismiss her. She had 34 buildings to answer with. This isn't just a story about a text message. It's about what happens when a woman is made invisible for so long that everyone forgets she's the one holding the lights on. If you've ever been made to feel like you were nothing by someone who needed you for everything, this story is for you. Hit the like button. It helps more people find this. And drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from tonight. Now, to understand what happened that Tuesday morning, we need to go back to where this really began. But first, the present. Because the present is where the story lives. And the present, on this particular Tuesday, is a waiting room on the 4th floor of Mercy Medical Center on St. Paul Street in Baltimore, where Caroline Whitmore Fitch has been sitting for 40 minutes in a plastic chair the color of old putty, wearing a coat her mother-in-law once described, in front of 8 people at a dinner table, as a practical choice for someone in her situation. The nurse, Angela Morris, had taken her blood pressure twice. She had written something on the intake form in a careful, unhurried hand, and not immediately shown Caroline what it said. The doctor, a quiet man named Dr. Reyes, who spoke the way people do when they are trying not to alarm you, had used the phrase nutritional deficiency with a careful pause before each word. He had asked if she was eating regularly. She had said yes. He had looked at the chart and not said anything else about it. Her phone was in her lap. The text arrived at 7:14 a.m. We're doing the reunion without you this year. Don't call Mom about it. No punctuation, no period. 12 words from a man she had been married to for 16 years, sent from a lake house in the Berkshires, where, at that precise moment, a woman named Sasha Merrill was arranging herself into the family photographs that Lorraine Fitch had been quietly planning for months. Caroline read the text once. Her hands were still. The waiting room smelled of recycled air and the ghost of someone else's coffee. She did not look up. She did not exhale loudly or press her lips together or do any of the things a person does when something hits them. She simply opened the next tab on her phone, a tab she had opened and closed 11 times in the past 11 months. And looked again at the listing for a restored 1920s craftsman on Thurman Avenue in Portland, Oregon. 3 bedrooms, west-facing windows, 3 blocks from the waterfront office she had been slowly, carefully, deliberately building toward for the better part of a year. The irony is sharp enough to draw blood. The man who just told her she wasn't wanted at his family gathering had no idea that his wife was, at that precise moment, the principal owner of 34 commercial properties across 4 states. He had no idea that the building where he had worked for 6 years where he pulled his Audi into the third-floor parking structure every Monday through Friday without a second thought, sat inside a portfolio worth $18.7 million. He had no idea that the name on that portfolio, on every trust document, on every lease agreement filed with every county clerk across Maryland, Virginia, Delaware, and Pennsylvania, was not Fitch. It had never been Fitch. It was Whitmore. Angela Morris called her name. Caroline stood. The appointment took 22 minutes. Doctor. Reyes gave her a printed summary of his recommendations: increased caloric intake, iron supplements, a follow-up in 30 days, and told her gently that stress had a way of expressing itself in the body long before a person was ready to acknowledge it. Caroline thanked him. She folded the paper into her coat pocket. She took the elevator down alone. In the parking lot, she did not get into the car immediately. She stood beside the driver's door for a moment in the October air, the city moving around her at its ordinary Tuesday pace, and she opened the trust summary on her phone. She had looked at it only twice since her mother's death 18 months ago, once the day after the funeral, when grief had made the numbers meaningless, and once 3 weeks ago, when something in her had finally gone quiet enough to read. Whitmore Property Holdings, LLC. Sole beneficiary, Caroline Ann Whitmore. Portfolio valuation. As of the most recent annual assessment, $18,740,000, 34 properties, including, listed 7th in the Maryland column, the commercial office building at 1140 East Pratt Street, Baltimore. Current tenant, primary leaseholder, Meridian Commercial Group, Daniels Company, Daniels Building, Daniels Garage. She got into the car. She sat with both hands in her lap for a long moment. Then she started the engine and drove home. The house on Underwood Road in Guilford was a large, federal-style brick home that Lorraine had selected opinions about and Daniel had selected for its address. Caroline had lived in it for 11 years. She walked through the front door and stood in the entry hall and looked at it the way she had not let herself look at it in a very long time. Not as home, but as inventory. The furniture they had chosen together. The art she had picked alone. The kitchen table her mother had once sat at, making lists on yellow legal paper, her reading glasses pushed up into her gray hair, her handwriting fast and precise, and entirely without decoration. Caroline went to the kitchen. She found the yellow legal pad in the drawer beside the refrigerator, exactly where her mother had always kept one. She set her phone face down on the counter, text side down, 12 words face down. She uncapped a pen. She began to write. The list her mother used to make at this table had always started the same way, not with what needed to be done, but with what was already true. Assets first, Margaret Whitmore had told her once. Always start with what you actually have. Everything else is just math. Caroline wrote the date at the top of the page. Tuesday, October. Then, in the careful, unhurried hand of a woman who had once been a very good commercial real estate analyst and had never, not truly, stopped being one, she began. Margaret Whitmore made her first list at a kitchen table in Annapolis in the spring of 1987. Caroline was 7 years old and sitting across from her, eating cereal, watching her mother's hand move across a yellow legal pad in the fast, unhurried way it always moved, as though her thoughts were simply too efficient to slow down for the pen. The list that morning was a column of numbers, property addresses. A name at the top that Caroline would not understand for another decade. Whitmore Property Holdings, LLC. The warehouse on Boucher Avenue in Annapolis cost Margaret $112,000. She had saved for 11 years to buy it. She leased it within 60 days to a regional logistics company, collected the income quietly, reinvested it without ceremony, and told no one outside of her attorney's office what she had done. That was the whole philosophy, delivered not as a speech but as a practice. Caroline watched her mother repeat, year after year, property after property, until the portfolio was a thing of genuine weight, and her mother was still driving the same sensible Volvo she had bought in 1993. Never perform wealth, Margaret told her once, when Caroline was in her 20s and beginning her own training as a commercial real estate analyst. Never volunteer leverage. The woman who shows her hand early loses the table. Caroline had laughed a little. She hadn't fully understood it yet. She would. The trust was structured with Margaret's attorney, a careful man named Harold Stein at Stein & Caro in Annapolis, who later handed the file to his junior partner, Margaret Isles, when his health declined in 2009. The terms were clean. Irrevocable upon Margaret's death. Caroline the sole beneficiary, all assets registered under the Whitmore name, regardless of Caroline's marital status. There was a prenuptial agreement, too. Margaret had insisted on it before the wedding with the quiet certainty of a woman who had spent 30 years watching what happened to assets, when love was assumed to be a sufficient legal instrument. Daniel had signed it at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning in June of 2007, skimming it the way men skim documents they have already decided not to worry about. He had shaken Harold Stein's hand afterward and said something charming. Harold Stein had smiled and said nothing. Daniel Fitch, in those early years, was genuinely worth loving. That is the part of the story that makes the rest of it matter. He was tall and warm, and he laughed easily, and he looked at Caroline in the first years of their marriage, the way people look at something they cannot quite believe belongs to them. He did not know the full scope of the trust. Caroline had told him she had inherited some property from her mother's side, a few holdings, modest, well-managed, and he had nodded and moved on, satisfied, because the detail fit the story he had already constructed about her. A quiet woman from a comfortable family, steady, grateful in her way, not ambitious, which he had mistaken for contentment. Caroline had not corrected him. She had trusted the marriage enough to believe it would never require her to. That trust was the most costly thing she ever gave him. More costly than the 16 years. More costly than the silence. Margaret had seen it clearly, even then. She had pulled Caroline aside the evening before the wedding, not to talk her out of it, she was too practical for that, but to say one thing, plainly, with both of Caroline's hands held in both of hers. You are always the asset, my love. Remember that. Everything else is just collateral. Caroline had cried a little, because it was the night before her wedding and she was happy, and she had heard the words as love and not yet as instruction. The years passed. The portfolio grew. Margaret aged in the way of women who have always had something to do. Purposefully, without much complaint, making her lists at the kitchen table in Annapolis until she couldn't anymore. When the diagnosis came, she spent less time on the phone and more time with Harold Stein's successor, making sure the document said exactly what she intended. When she died on a Wednesday morning in April, 18 months before this story's present day, she left Caroline 34 properties, an irrevocable trust, a letter in a sealed envelope tucked inside the trust folder, and a Volvo that Caroline still could not bring herself to sell. Then something shifted. The absence of Margaret Whitmore changed the temperature of everything. Lorraine had always been careful around Margaret. Not warm, not even particularly civil, but careful, in the way of a woman who recognizes a different kind of power and chooses not to test it directly. After the funeral, the carefulness evaporated. The comments came faster. The invitations arrived with new, quiet conditions attached. Daniel, who had always positioned himself between the two women just enough to maintain plausible deniability, stopped repositioning. Caroline stood at the graveside on a gray April morning, holding a single stem of white freesia, her mother's flower, and felt the cold settle into her coat. She was aware, without turning to look, that Daniel was standing slightly behind her and to the left, his attention already somewhere else. He had put his hand on her shoulder during the service. He had not spoken much since. She did not understand yet what his distance meant. She would spend the next 18 months finding out, one small withdrawal at a time, until the distance had a name, and the name had a hotel receipt attached to it. But that morning, at the grave, she was simply a daughter who had lost her mother. She pressed the freesia stem between both palms and held it the way her mother had always held things she wanted to keep. Carefully, without clutching, as though trust were a form of grip. The distance Daniel kept at the graveside did not close in the weeks that followed. Caroline had expected grief to do what grief was supposed to do, draw people toward each other, or at least create the conditions for nearness. Instead, it created a kind of weather in the house on Underwood Road. Something overcast and close. Daniel moved through it without appearing to notice it was there. The changes were small enough, in the beginning, that Caroline questioned her own perception before she questioned his behavior. That was the architecture of it, the way it was built to be doubted. He stopped asking her opinion at dinner parties, not rudely, simply by redirecting his attention 1 second before it reached her. He stopped mentioning her work history to new acquaintances, not correcting it, not lying, just allowing the silence to fill itself in. She had been a commercial real estate analyst before the marriage, a good one, trained at Cushman & Wakefield's Baltimore office for 6 years before the children arrived, and the balance shifted. That history did not disappear. It simply stopped being volunteered. By 2020, the phrase had entered his vocabulary. She heard it first at a dinner with colleagues from Meridian, a man named Brett Colson and his wife, who had asked Caroline what she did. Daniel had answered before she could. She's between things professionally. He had said it smoothly, without looking at her. The table had moved on. Caroline had held her water glass with both hands and said nothing, because the sentence was technically true and practically a door closing in her face. The irony sits quietly here, as it always does. The woman he described as between things professionally was, at that same moment, the principal owner of 34 commercial properties generating annual revenue he would not have been able to name. On every lease, every contract, every filing with the Maryland Department of Assessments and Taxation, she was not Caroline Fitch. She was Caroline Ann Whitmore. He didn't notice. He had never thought to look. Then came Lorraine. Margaret's death had removed the only person in the room Lorraine genuinely chose not to test. The first Thanksgiving without Margaret, Lorraine arrived at the house on Underwood Road with a casserole and a campaign. It was subtle enough to deny and consistent enough to constitute a strategy. She began describing Caroline's grief as fragility. She began describing Caroline's quietness as vacancy. At a Sunday lunch in Towson in March of 2021, with Daniel's brother Richard and his wife present, Lorraine set down her fork and said, with the specific warmth of a woman performing concern, "I just worry sometimes that Caroline doesn't have enough going on. It's not healthy, all that time alone in the house." The table went quiet in the way tables do when something true and unkind has been said, and no one wants to be the one to name it. Richard looked at his plate. His wife refilled her water glass. Daniel did not say anything. Caroline reached for the bread basket and passed it left. That was the thing about Lorraine's cruelty. It required no response because it was never framed as an attack. It arrived as love. It dressed itself in worry and consideration and the language of concern, and by the time a person organized a reply, the moment had already passed, and the damage was already done. A memory surfaced later that same evening, driving home. Margaret had warned her once, not about Lorraine specifically, but about the type. Some women build themselves up by finding someone willing to stay small, she had said. Don't be the someone. Caroline had tucked it away. She was tucking away a great deal by then. The name Sasha entered the house in the spring of 2021. A colleague, Daniel had said, in the casual tone he used for information he was presenting as boring. Smart. Good at her job. She'd been instrumental on the Hargrove account. Caroline had nodded. The name meant nothing to her then. It would come up again in August, just once more, a different context, a regional conference in Philadelphia. And then in October, not spoken aloud but visible on the screen of the shared iPad left open on the kitchen counter, where the Marriott Bonvoy account showed a 2-night stay at the Renaissance Pittsburgh Hotel, dates corresponding to a work trip Caroline had been told was a single overnight. She did not confront him. She closed the browser tab and set the iPad face down on the counter, and she stood at the kitchen sink for a long time, looking out at the back garden her mother had helped her plant in the first year of the marriage. The hydrangeas gone brown at the edges now in the late season, and she thought perhaps she had misread it. Perhaps she had miscounted the nights. Lorraine had been telling people for months that Caroline's grief had made her unreliable, prone to misremembering, prone to catastrophizing. Perhaps that was true. Perhaps she was that now. She watched for 3 more months. In January of 2022, she found a charge on the shared credit card statement for a dinner at Canlis Restaurant in Seattle. Daniel had been in Seattle for a Thursday sales conference. He had texted her a photograph of the hotel room. The charge at Canlis was for 2. He had told her he ate at the hotel. She did not cry. She did not confront. She lay in bed that night in the dark with her eyes open and her hands flat on the quilt, and she simply understood, with the clear-eyed finality of a woman who has been given one too many pieces of evidence to keep choosing doubt, that she had been alone in this marriage for a very long time. Perhaps years, longer than she had been willing to measure. She was still choosing patience. But patience, she was beginning to understand, had a structure. And structures, her mother had taught her, had load-bearing limits. The patience she had chosen for so long was about to become expensive. It began at a Harris Teeter on Falls Road on a Wednesday morning in November. Caroline had a cart with perhaps $40 of groceries in it. Bread, chicken, a bag of oranges her doctor had mentioned at the previous visit, the kind of purchase a person makes when they are trying, quietly and without fanfare, to eat better. The cashier, a young man named Derek with a trainee badge still on his apron, ran the joint debit card and looked at his screen with the particular careful blankness of someone who does not want to deliver news. "Declined," he said. She said it again as a question. "Declined?" And he nodded, and the woman in line behind Caroline shifted her weight. Caroline handed him cash from her wallet and pushed the cart out to the parking lot and sat in the car for a long time before she started the engine. She called Daniel from the car. He answered on the 3rd ring with the smooth, slightly distracted energy of a man between meetings. There had been a restructuring of the accounts, he said. Temporary. He was consolidating things. He would sort it out by the end of the week. His tone was the tone he used when explaining things that did not require her input. Not unkind, simply conclusive. The call lasted 4 minutes. Nothing was sorted out by the end of the week. The second card was canceled 10 days later. This one Caroline discovered not at a register, but by checking the account app on her phone on a Tuesday afternoon, which showed a 0 balance where 4 months earlier there had been a shared household fund of approximately $6,000. She called the bank directly this time. The branch manager, a careful woman named Sandra Oates at the Charles Street location, confirmed that the account had been restructured and that authorization changes had been made by the primary account holder. Primary account holder. The phrase sat in Caroline's chest, like a stone that had been there for a while, without her naming it. She drove to the branch, Sandra Oates walked her through the account history with the practiced neutrality of a professional who understood that the woman sitting across from her was experiencing something that was not, technically, the bank's problem. Caroline thanked her and drove to the parking lot of the Whole Foods 2 blocks away and sat with her hands in her lap and understood, with the same clear-eyed certainty she had brought to the Seattle credit card statement, that this was not administration. This was architecture. Someone had drawn a blueprint. This was what the building looked like. The narrator will say plainly what Daniel Fitch apparently believed he was constructing. A record. A pattern of instability and dependence. A woman with no access and no income and no professional history, who had been described at family gatherings for 2 years as struggling since her mother's death. What he was actually constructing, for anyone paying attention, was a case to be picked apart by a very good attorney. He had not thought about the attorney. He had not thought about the trust. He had not thought about the name on 34 commercial leases, none of which said Fitch. Around this same time, Lorraine escalated her own campaign with the specific efficiency of a woman who had been waiting for the right conditions. She began making calls. To Daniel's brother Richard. To Daniel's Aunt Patricia in Annapolis. To 3 members of the extended Fitch family who had attended every reunion for the past decade. The message in each call was shaped like concern. She's really been struggling since her mother passed. I worry about the children. Daniel has been so patient with her. It was not dramatic. It was not accusatory. It was the steady, gentle excavation of a foundation, delivered in the warm voice of a woman who had spent 40 years practicing the art of damage that looked like love. Caroline's body, meanwhile, was keeping its own honest record. Her doctor, Patricia Juan, at the Mercy Medical Associates practice on Cathedral Street, flagged her blood pressure at a routine appointment in January. Then her iron levels. Then her weight, which had dropped 11 pounds in 4 months without intention. Dr. Juan asked about her sleep, about her appetite, about stress levels at home. Caroline said things were fine. Dr. Juan wrote something in the chart and asked her to come back in 6 weeks. The thyroid condition, which had been manageable for years, had begun expressing itself in her face and her energy, and the swollenness around her eyes that Lorraine had photographed at Christmas and sent to someone Caroline would never identify. Her body was not lying, even when she was. Then came the photograph. Daniel had told her in February that the Meridian Quarterly dinner had been canceled. A scheduling conflict, he'd said. She had believed him. She had stayed home that Thursday evening and made soup from a recipe her mother had left in a handwritten index card, tucked in the kitchen drawer. Chicken and white bean, Margaret's recipe. The one Caroline made when she needed to feel that something in her life was still continuous and steady. She had eaten alone. She had washed the bowl. The following morning, a colleague of Daniel's named Kevin Park posted a photograph to his LinkedIn page. The caption read, "Great team. Great night." There were 11 people in the frame. Daniel was in the center, turned slightly left, laughing at something off-camera. Beside him, chin lifted, one hand resting easily on the back of her chair, was Sasha Merrill. The dinner had not been canceled. It had simply not included Caroline. She looked at the photograph for a long time. Not at Sasha, at the empty space on Daniel's right side, where, in any ordinary version of this life, she would have been standing. She closed the app. She put the phone face down on the counter beside her mother's recipe card. She stood in the kitchen of the house on Underwood Road, and she breathed slowly, and she understood at last with her whole body what she had known in her mind for months. The endurance she had practiced so carefully and for so long had not protected anything. It had simply made her easier to move around. The patience had an expiration date. It was coming soon. The expiration date, as it turned out, was a Tuesday in October. But before we arrive at that Tuesday, before we returned to the waiting room on St. Paul Street and the text that changed the accounting of everything. We need to go to the Berkshires first. We need to see what was happening at the other end of that message. Because the text did not arrive from nowhere. It arrived from a lake house on Stockbridge Bowl that Caroline Fitch had rented for 4 days, and it arrived from a man who had already, by 7:14 in the morning, made several decisions that Tuesday that he believed were entirely his to make. The Fitch family reunion had been Lorraine's tradition for 11 years. She organized it with the efficient warmth of a woman who understood that controlling the guest list was the same as controlling the narrative. In previous years, Caroline had attended. She had driven up from Baltimore, made the right conversation, helped in the kitchen when Lorraine's back was turned, and smiled at the right moments and said very little. She had never been made to feel welcome. She had made her peace with that and gone anyway, because the children were there, and because she had believed, for longer than was reasonable, that showing up was its own form of argument. This year, Lorraine had made the arrangements in August. She had sent a group message to 17 family members with the dates, the address, and a cheerful note about the dock and the kayaks. Caroline's name was not in the thread. She had not noticed immediately. By the time she did, Daniel had already confirmed for both of them. Or so he told her. "It will be fine," he'd said. "You're expected." She had packed a bag the week before the text arrived. The bag was still in the bedroom closet when she sat in the hospital waiting room and learned otherwise. What was happening at Stockbridge Bowl on that Tuesday morning would not reach Caroline's knowledge for several weeks. She would piece it together later, from a photograph, from a comment Daniel's brother Richard made that he would immediately regret, from the particular silence of certain family members who had known her for a decade and said nothing. But the audience can see it now. That is the nature of this story. At 6:50 a.m., Lorraine was in the lake house kitchen in a pressed linen blouse, arranging a fruit plate with the specific care of a woman who wanted the morning to look effortless. The large windows faced the water. The light was clean and cold. Around the kitchen island stood Daniel's brother Richard and his wife Jenna, Daniel's aunt Patricia, and 2 cousins whose names Caroline had learned and relearned every year because no one had ever thought to help her remember them. And there was Sasha Merrill, in a camel-colored sweater, pouring coffee with the easy familiarity of a woman who had been in this kitchen before. Not in this kitchen specifically, but in this position. She moved through the space with her chin lifted and her shoulders open, the posture of someone who had already decided the room was hers, and was simply waiting for everyone else to reach the same conclusion. Daniel stood near the window, with his back to the room, looking at the water. He had his phone in his hand. At 7:06 a.m., Lorraine raised a coffee mug and said, "I just want to say how glad I am that we're all here. The family we're building going forward." She looked around the room with the measured warmth she had practiced her whole life, and the room smiled back, and no one said anything about Caroline, and the silence on that subject was as deliberate and as crafted as everything else Lorraine had ever arranged. At 7:14 a.m., Daniel looked at his phone and typed 12 words. He did not agonize over them. He did not rewrite them. He sent them in the practiced, conclusive way of a man who had been moving toward this moment for 2 years and had simply arrived. Then he set the phone face down on the windowsill and turned back to the room. Now we go back to Baltimore. The waiting room on the 4th floor of Mercy Medical Center smelled of recycled air. The chairs were the color of old putty. The overhead light was the particular flat white of institutional spaces that make everyone inside them look slightly unwell. Caroline sat with her coat on and her hands in her lap, and the thyroid condition that Dr. Juan had been monitoring for 3 months had done its patient, unglamorous work on her face and her energy and the softness around her eyes that she had stopped trying to minimize. She was 44 years old, and she had not eaten a full meal in 11 days, and she was sitting alone in a hospital waiting room while a family she had belonged to for 16 years toasted their future without using her name. Her phone screen lit up at 7:14 a.m. "We're doing the reunion without you this year. Don't call Mom about it." The audience has heard these words before. In the opening minutes of this story, they landed in abstract. A woman, a text, a gap between what she held and what they knew. Now they land in full context. Every small withdrawal Daniel had made since Margaret's funeral. Every Lorraine comment shaped like concern. Every canceled card and tracked calendar and dinner she hadn't been told about. The can lease receipt. The LinkedIn photograph. The bag still packed in the bedroom closet. 12 words that were not the beginning of anything. They were simply the last sentence of a story that had been written, word by careful word, for 2 years. While he sent that text, she owned the building he would drive to on Monday morning. While Lorraine made that toast, her name was on 34 commercial leases that Lorraine had never thought to read. While the Fitch family built its future without her, Caroline Whitmore Fitch sat in a hospital waiting room, and her phone lit up with the one message that, in the end, would cost them everything they had never known she held. She read it once. She set the phone face down on her knee, the same gesture she had made in the kitchen in February, when she closed the LinkedIn app over Kevin Park's photograph. The same gesture, a different weight behind it, because this time something had shifted, quietly, finally, and without a sound that anyone in that lake house would have heard. She was done waiting for the structure to hold. She did not go back inside. The hospital's automatic doors had closed behind her 20 minutes earlier, and she had not looked back at them. She sat in the car in the parking structure on St. Paul Street, with the engine off and her hands in her lap, and the October light coming through the concrete gaps in thin, indifferent strips. The appointment paperwork was folded in her coat pocket. The text was still on her phone, face down on the passenger seat. She did not pick it up. What she picked up, after a long moment of simply sitting, was the phone's file app. She navigated to the folder she had not opened since the week after the funeral, the folder Margaret Isles had sent her 18 months ago, containing the scanned trust documents, the property schedules, the beneficiary confirmation, and, at the very bottom of the file list, a single PDF labeled in her mother's attorney's handwriting. Personal letter, M. Whitmore. To be opened by Caroline. She had opened it once. 3 days after the funeral, sitting on the bathroom floor of the house on Underwood Road at 2 a.m, she had read it, and then put the phone down and pressed her back against the cold tile wall and let herself come apart in the only room in the house where no one would hear her. She had not opened it again. Grief had made the words too large to hold. She opened it now. Her mother's handwriting filled the scanned page in the fast, efficient hand Caroline had watched move across legal pads her entire childhood. The letter was not long. Margaret Whitmore had never been a woman who used more words than a situation required. She wrote about the trust, briefly, its structure, its purpose, the reasons she had built it the way she had. She wrote about Isles and Caro and the contact information from Margaret Isles, whom she described as meticulous and entirely without sentiment, which she meant as the highest praise. And then, near the bottom of the page, in the same plain, concrete voice she had always used for the things that mattered most, she had written the line that Caroline had heard at the wedding rehearsal dinner and filed away as love and not yet understood as architecture. "You were always the asset, my love. Everything else is just collateral." The first time, it had been comfort. The arms of a mother around a daughter on the night before a marriage. The second time, in the raw weeks after the funeral, it had been grief. The voice of someone gone, speaking from a page. Now, sitting in a parking structure in Baltimore with a text on the passenger seat that had stripped the last pretense from 16 years of careful endurance. the words landed as something else entirely. Not comfort, not grief. Instruction. Caroline read the line once more. She set the phone on her knee. Then she picked it back up and navigated to her contacts and pressed the name she had stored under Isles and Caro, Estate, and found there immediately, without hesitation. Margaret Isles answered on the second ring. The call lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds. Caroline would remember this later, not because she timed it, but because the precision felt right. That the thing she had spent 2 years building toward required less than 5 minutes to set in motion once she had actually decided. Margaret Isles asked 3 questions. She made 4 statements. There was no preamble and no condolence, and no pause for emotional processing, which was exactly what Caroline needed from the most reliable thing in the room, even when the room was a car. File the divorce. Yes. Begin the asset disclosure preparation. Yes. Initiate the Portland lease under the Whitmore name. The 12-month agreement on Thurman Avenue, the one that had been pending her signature for 11 months. Yes. And forward the formal lease renewal notice for the property at 1140 East Pratt Street to the VP of Real Estate at Meridian Commercial Group. Standard procedure. 30 days notice. Yes. The call ended. Caroline set the phone on the passenger seat beside the dismissed text and started the engine. She drove home through the city in the particular stillness of a person who has made a decision and feels, on the other side of it, not elation, but a deep, load-bearing calm. The kind of calm that has structure, the kind her mother had always moved through. On every commercial lease she had ever signed, on every property filing in 4 states, on every document in the Whitmore Trust portfolio, she was not Caroline Fitch. She had never been Caroline Fitch in any room that mattered. She was Caroline Ann Whitmore, sole beneficiary, principal owner, the woman her mother had spent 30 years building a foundation for. And she had simply been waiting, with more patience than was reasonable and more love than was wise, for the marriage to become worth protecting. It was not. It had not been for a very long time. The house on Underwood Road was quiet when she arrived. She moved through it without ceremony. She went directly to the back of the house, to the room she had kept unchanged since Margaret's death, her mother's study, still holding the smell of the particular cedar drawer sachets Margaret had always used, still arranged with the same bookshelves and the same wide mahogany desk that had come from the Annapolis house. Caroline sat at the desk. She opened her laptop. She booked a one-way flight to Portland, Oregon, departing Thursday at 6:45 a.m., non-stop on Alaska Airlines. The confirmation arrived in her inbox 30 seconds later. She did not cry. She pulled 2 suitcases from the hall closet. She set them open on the floor of the study and began, with the calm and efficient attention of a woman who had once been a very good commercial real estate analyst and had never, not truly, stopped being one, to choose what was worth taking and what could stay. Before she began, she went back to the coat she had worn to the hospital. She reached into the pocket and removed the letter, still in its PDF form on the phone she'd printed once and carried since. And then she found the folded copy she had printed 3 weeks ago when she first read the estate documents with clear eyes. She smoothed it once between her palms. She folded it again. She placed it in the inside pocket of the coat, close to her chest, where it would stay until Portland. Thursday was 2 days away. The reveal mechanism was already in motion. Every document was already filed, signed, or in transit. All that remained was the flight. 3 weeks after Caroline Fitch boarded a one-way flight to Portland, Oregon, she was standing in the kitchen of the Thurman Avenue Craftsman House at 8:47 on a Monday morning, holding a coffee with both hands and looking out at a yard full of late-season dahlias that the previous tenant had left behind. The Pacific fog had not fully lifted. It sat low over the neighborhood in the particular soft way it did most mornings, turning the light diffuse and unhurried. She had learned, in 3 weeks, to like it. She had learned to like a great many things about a city that did not know her as Daniel Fitch's wife, did not know her as the woman who made gatherings tense, did not know her as anything at all yet, which was, she was discovering, the specific texture of freedom. She was wearing her mother's cardigan. It was old and oversized and the color of oatmeal, and it had been folded in the second suitcase beneath everything else, and she had found it on the first morning and had not taken it off indoors since. Her face had begun to lose some of the thyroid swollenness that Dr. Juan had been monitoring. She was eating. She was sleeping through the night. Her children were with her, and they were enrolled in their new school on Southwest Canby Street, and the younger one had already made a friend whose mother had knocked on the door with a pie, which was the kind of thing, Caroline was finding, that happened in a city where no one was performing anything. She did not know at 8:47 a.m. that 1,700 miles east, in a building she owned, a Monday morning was beginning to come apart. At 9:05 a.m. Baltimore time, a woman named Teresa Vogel, the VP of Real Estate at Meridian Commercial Group, forwarded a document to the floor managers whose suites fell under the affected lease plan. The document was a formal renewal notice from Whitmore Property Holdings, LLC, regarding the commercial lease at 1140 East Pratt Street, Baltimore. It was a standard communication, 30 days notice of upcoming renewal terms, signature required from the tenant's authorized representative. Teresa Vogel had been dealing with the Whitmore portfolio for 2 years and found the communications efficient and the terms fair. She added a brief note to the forwarded email. Please review and confirm receipt with your floor coordinator by end of week. Daniel received the email at 9:05 a.m. He was at his desk on the 7th floor. He had a coffee from the building lobby. He read the subject line, noted it was a lease matter, and opened it with the mild attention a regional sales director gives to administrative correspondence that does not, in his estimation, require him to do much. He read the name Whitmore Property Holdings. He did not react. Not yet. The name sat in his mind without attaching to anything, the way names do when you have heard them without listening. He scrolled to the signature block at the bottom of the renewal notice. Principal owner, Caroline Ann Whitmore. Contact for lease matters, Isles and Caro Estate and Property Law, Baltimore. The scene softened, and then snapped back sharp. His coffee cup was on the desk. He did not pick it up. He read the name again. Caroline Ann Whitmore. He looked at the building address in the header of the document. 1140 East Pratt Street. He looked out his office window at the view he had looked at every working day for 6 years. The inner harbor in the distance, the street 11 floors below, the parking structure to the left where he pulled in each morning through the gate on the east side, where the Whitmore Holdings LLC sign had been on the wall of the attendance booth the entire time, small and dark, and entirely visible to anyone who had ever thought to read it. He had never thought to read it. At 9:22 a.m., he typed 3 words into his browser. Whitmore Property Holdings, Baltimore. The results loaded in under 2 seconds. The company website. A Maryland Business Registry entry. A 2021 Baltimore Business Journal feature on the portfolio's expansion into Delaware and Pennsylvania. He clicked the business registry entry first. It was the most official looking. It loaded a standard filing page. Registered agent, Isles and Caro Estate and Property Law. Principal owner of record, Caroline Ann Whitmore. Date of registration, 1991. He stared at that date for a moment. 1991. and the arithmetic of it settled into him slowly, the way cold water does. His wife had been 7 years old in 1991. Her mother had been building this since before Caroline could read a lease. He clicked the Business Journal article. The portfolio was described in the third paragraph. 34 commercial properties across Maryland, Virginia, Delaware, and Pennsylvania. Estimated portfolio value at time of publication, $14.2 million. That had been 2021. The divorce disclosure would eventually show 18.7. But he did not know that number yet. 14.2 was already enough to change the shape of the last 16 years entirely. He did not move for 4 minutes. He sat at his desk on the 7th floor of a building he had just understood he did not work in so much as occupy, and the entire architecture of his assumptions about his marriage rearranged itself around a fact he had never bothered to locate. He picked up his phone at 9:51 a.m. and called Caroline. In Portland, the fog had begun to lift. Caroline was still in the kitchen. Her phone lit up on the counter, Daniel's name on the screen, and she looked at it for one full ring, and then she picked it up and answered. She did not say hello. She waited. Caroline. His voice had lost its salesman's smoothness. It sounded like a man standing in a room he thought he knew and finding the walls in the wrong place. The lease notice. The lease is under review, she said. So is everything else. She ended the call. She set the phone face down on the counter beside her coffee. She did not feel the need to say anything else, because there was nothing else to say that the documents had not already said more precisely and with greater authority than anything she could have offered in 16 years of marriage. He called back at 9:53. She did not answer. He called at 9:58, at 10:04, at 10:17. She did not answer. By noon, he had called 7 times. By 2:15 p.m., he had called 11. At 2:30 p.m., his assistant, a young man named Todd Bird, who had worked for Daniel for 3 years and had always found him composed, knocked on the office door and entered with an envelope in his hand, and the careful expression of someone delivering something they understand to be significant without knowing exactly what it means. The envelope was from Isles and Caro Estate and Property Law. Todd set it on the desk and left without being asked to. The divorce filing was 14 pages. The asset disclosure was attached as Exhibit A. The portfolio valuation was on page 3. Daniel read the number. He set the papers down. He picked them up. He read the number again. $18.7 million. Solely in the name of Caroline Ann Whitmore. Protected by a prenuptial agreement he had signed at a kitchen table on a Saturday morning in 2007, without reading carefully, because the morning had been sunny, and he had been charming, and he had not imagined, not for a single moment, that the document in front of him was the most important thing he would ever not read. Across town, in the offices of a different firm, Sasha Merrill received a forwarded email chain from a Meridian colleague. The kind of casual, look at this office gossip forward that circulates in open-plan offices when something unusual happens to someone senior. It included the lease notice. It included the asset disclosure summary that had already made its way through 2 forwarded chains before reaching her. She read the disclosure figure. She set her phone face down on her desk. She opened her laptop. She began, with the forward energy of a woman who had always known when an arrangement had changed, to look at other things. At 4:47 p.m., Daniel Fitch was still at his desk. The divorce papers were in front of him. The lease notice was beside them. His phone screen showed 11 missed calls, all outgoing, all to the same number, none returned. The harbor light was going gold through the window. The building around him held its ordinary Monday sounds, the elevator, the corridor conversation, the distant printer. and he sat inside all of it and understood, with the specific and irreversible clarity of a man who had just found the load-bearing wall he had spent 6 years casually removing, exactly what he had done. The weeks that followed moved at 2 different speeds in 2 different cities. In Baltimore, things moved fast and badly. Daniel's position at Meridian became complicated in the specific, airless way that professional standing becomes complicated when personal disaster intersects with institutional interest. The lease negotiation proceeded through Isles and Caro with the unhurried efficiency of a firm that had been managing this portfolio for decades and found nothing unusual about a renewal process that coincided with a divorce filing from the same principal owner. For Meridian's legal team, however, the discovery that their regional sales director's estranged wife was their landlord produced the kind of internal discomfort that does not appear on any org chart, but shapes every meeting. Daniel was not fired. He was not demoted. He was simply gradually managed around, the way organizations manage around things they cannot officially address and prefer not to have to explain to stakeholders. Sasha Merrill's desk was empty by the 3rd week of November. She had not made a scene. She had not sent a message. She had simply, with the clean efficiency of a woman who had always known the difference between an investment and a loss, updated her LinkedIn profile to show a new role at a firm in Philadelphia, and stopped returning Daniel's calls on a Tuesday afternoon. The arrangement had never been a love story. When it ended the way transactions end, not with feeling, but with a final accounting that came out unfavorable on one side. Lorraine called Caroline's mobile number on a Thursday evening in late October. The call rang 4 times. Caroline did not answer. The voicemail recorded 7 seconds of silence, and then the sound of a line disconnecting. Lorraine did not call again. That silence, 7 seconds and a hang-up, was the most honest thing she had managed in 16 years. There was no concern shaped like cruelty in it. There was no backhanded warmth. There was only a woman who had built her entire campaign on the assumption that Caroline Whitmore had nothing, confronting the specific defeat of having been wrong about the only thing that mattered. Daniel's long email arrived on a Friday. It was 4 paragraphs. The first was an explanation. The second was a reframing of the explanation. The third was something adjacent to an apology that stopped just short of naming what it was apologizing for. The fourth asked if they could talk. Margaret Isles acknowledged receipt on Caroline's behalf, in a single sentence that confirmed the communication had been received and directed all further correspondence to the firm. That was the last direct contact. The custody proceedings were brief and without conflict, which surprised no one at Isles and Caro, and may have surprised Daniel, who had perhaps expected the asset disclosure to produce a different kind of woman than it produced. It did not produce a combative woman. It produced the same woman it had always been dealing with, steady, precise, genuinely concerned with the children's stability, and entirely unmoved by the leverage she held. The children were with Caroline. The school on Southwest Canby Street was working out. The younger one had been in 3 after-school activities by November. The older one had started sleeping better. Both of them, for the first time in a year, had stopped asking questions whose answers required careful navigation. Now the scene settles into something quieter. In Portland, in the mornings, Caroline made coffee and stood at the kitchen window in her mother's cardigan and watched the neighborhood come awake. The Craftsman house on Thurman Avenue had revealed itself slowly, the way houses do when you begin to actually live in them, rather than just occupy them. The built-in bookshelves in the study held her mother's reference books now, unpacked from the second suitcase. The kitchen had good light in the afternoon. The dahlias in the backyard, which she had assumed were finished for the season, had produced a second bloom in October that she had not expected, and had found, when she discovered it one morning, disproportionately moving. She had pinned her mother's letter above the desk in the study. Not framed, just pinned. 4 corners, the page slightly uneven, the handwriting visible from across the room. She did not read it every day. She did not need to. It was simply present in the way that useful things are present, not decorative, not ceremonial. Just there, doing its quiet structural work. She understood it now as she had not understood it at the wedding rehearsal dinner, and differently than she had understood it in the parking garage on a Tuesday in October. It was not comfort, and it was not instruction. It was simply true. It had always been true. You were always the asset, my love. Everything else is just collateral. Her mother had said this about money and property and legal architecture, yes, but she had also said it about something larger, about the specific, irreducible fact of a woman who knows her own worth in a room full of people who have decided not to notice it. The money was real, the portfolio was real, but the asset her mother had been pointing to, with her practical and unsentimental love, had always been Caroline herself. She had simply spent 16 years in a house where no one said so. There is something important to understand about this story, and about the many stories like it that play out in quieter ways, in ordinary lives, every day. Real power and visible power are not the same thing. A woman can own the ground beneath a man's feet and still be made to feel she has no footing. The confusion of silence with absence, of modesty with emptiness, of steadiness with simplicity. These are not innocent mistakes. They are the specific errors of people who need someone to be less than them in order to feel like enough. What Caroline Fitch discovered, what every woman in her position discovers, eventually, is that the moment you stop needing their version of you to be true, the whole architecture of their control dissolves. Not dramatically, not with confrontation or raised voices. Simply, it becomes irrelevant. And you are left standing on ground that was always yours, breathing air you had briefly, inexplicably, forgotten was available. If any part of this story felt familiar to you, if you have ever been made to feel small by someone who needed you to stay that way, leave a comment below. This community sees you. And if you're new here, tell us where in the world you're watching from tonight. On a November morning in Portland, with the fog lifting off the Thurman Avenue neighborhood in the unhurried way it always did, Caroline Whitmore stood at the west-facing windows of her house and pushed them open for the first time. The air that came through was cold and clean, and carried the distant suggestion of the waterfront 3 blocks away. She stood in it for a long moment, soft-figured, warm, wearing her mother's cardigan in a house that was wholly and unambiguously hers, and she breathed. She was not celebrating. She was simply breathing. It turned out, after everything, that was enough.